Just to recap what we've done so far, um, for COMET overall, in case you haven't been, able to attend all of the sessions. We started out by discussing the scope of COMET, looked at kind of the timeline of activity, collaborated on our and finalized a vision statement for the task force overall. We had product development and governance listening sessions that both had reader heads to engage with, and we documented those discussions after the discussions and people had had a chance to comment on the reader heads. So this is our final listening session ahead of creating the community call to action and hosting our webinar in just a couple of weeks' time to present that. So I think, John, you
Yeah,
can.
I think,
Yeah.
yeah. So just as a reminder, the goal of all this work that we've been doing so far is to produce that call to action. So what we mean by that is in March, we will be sending out information around the work that we've done so far, the documentation we've created, the recommendations and the outlines of opportunities and challenges that we've created, and sending that out to the community. That will begin in March with a webinar. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the call today. As Claire mentioned, that will be on March 5th. And the goal of that webinar will be to familiarize the wider community with the work here and to launch that call to action that will include two main components. A call for people who have sources of information, sources of enrichments to raise their hand and see if they're interested in being involved in something that falls within the scope that we've been articulating. And the other second one is organizations and people interested in bringing resources to the table and seeing what we can do to bring together a way for the community to move forward and take action on these ideas. So we'll be talking about that a little bit more at the end of the call today, but it's just really a reminder of why we've been working on this for the last 3 months and what we have ahead of us.
Great. So I think, Juan Pablo, you're going to talk through today's task.
Yeah, so the idea is to have a discussion around the implementation scenario that hopefully you had a chance to read. There's already a lot of great comments and the beginnings of the conversation that started happening there. And as mentioned, we had some of that conversation in the morning session as well with the participants that were here. But what I wanted to sort of emphasize as we springboard into that discussion is to really think about not so much on all of the details of the specifics of what's in the implementation scenario, but rather to think about that implementation scenario as a way of identifying what are some of the elements of what the COMET model could look like, what are the aspects of what you think an implementation should consider. And so just as an example of the kinds of things that we might want to always zoom out from the specific details is in that implementation scenario. For example, the proposal is for there to be, or thinking about having 3 organizations that are participating in how the implementation is put forward. If you don't think that having 3 organizations seems right to you, to not say focus, well, I think it should be 4 organizations or I should be 2, but rather to really start thinking about what is it that you like about having multiple organizations participate, or whether you would think that it would be best led by a single organization, or what are the elements of your critique with the specifics that make you something that you want to then have a conversation and a considerations around any eventual implementation. So we just wanted to emphasize that this is really hypothetical implementation. It's not really intended to say this is our proposal for exactly what it should look like. It really was a way of laying out something that could be concrete enough that allows us to discover what are some of the other considerations that need to be taken into account. Another way of thinking about it, and maybe I'm just belaboring the point, but another way of thinking about it is as you go through that implementation and you think about the questions, is to think about it as an exercise of stop, start, and continue. What are some of the aspects of what's in there that you think are definitely no-goes for you, that things this seems like the wrong-headed way to go about it, and that there's elements there of things that you definitely don't want to see in any eventual implementation. Some elements of things that are not getting mentioned, but that you think are important that we have missed and are not being considered in that particular hypothetical scenario, or elements in there that you think, maybe you don't know all of the details of what an eventual implementation needs to look like, but you see some aspects of that hypothetical scenario that you think this seems right to me, or this seems like something that I really want to see. So we just want to make sure that we emphasize that this is just hypothetical and that it really should just be a springing board for identifying some of the characteristics of any eventual implementation that gets put forward. With that, let me turn it to back to John, I think. No, to Adam, sorry.
Actually, that's me.
To walk us,
Yeah.
Yeah,
to walk us through the details of the scenario for those
Yeah.
that didn't get through the 23 pages in as much detail as you maybe would have liked.
Exactly. So if you didn't read it, now is your chance to get the Cliff Notes version, which I'm going to provide. So again, just the contours of the hypothetical scenario as they were presented. The service is structured as a joint initiative between a membership organization, a university, and a Scalcoms nonprofit. The service adheres to the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, POSI, to guarantee its kind of overall openness, sustainability, and ability to continue independent of any one organization's ability to run it or participate in it. That the organization, or I'm sorry, that the service would be governed by a supervisory board from those partner organizations that we talked about, as well as having a global community advisory group. That there would also be some form of volunteer curation body responsible for certain work relating to metadata review. Next slide, please. In terms of initial focus for a hypothetical service, the service would take a fields as features approach, where it focuses on incremental development that supports changes to specific metadata fields rather than full record updates. Within that framing, it takes affiliation metadata and organizational identifiers, ROR IDs, as a first target for this incremental development. It expands to include additional metadata fields after learning and iterating on how to handle affiliation fields in this kind of MVP context. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of onboarding, ingest, and review, we assume that affiliation enrichments are derived from enrichment providers working with or processing open access PDFs in some fashion. So we have an openly accessible object to check claims against. We also assume that enrichment providers undergo a structured onboarding process so that they're able to be identified in the service with kind of an enrichment provider profile and contribute enrichments to it. We assume that the service accepts enrichment submissions from these providers in a standardized JSON format. Also that all of those enrichments go through a set of automated check for things like duplicates or conflicts between sources. As part of that process, in the case of unresolvable issues, such as conflicts between enrichment processes, we kind of redirect that to human curators for review with transparent logging for any decisions that they make as part of the process. Next slide. We then assume that the service is non-destructive, meaning that enrichments are an additional layer that sits on top of DOI metadata with base enriched views of metadata being provided via an API, that all enrichments are also separately provided as a CC0 public data file consistent with POSI. Also that there is a system for continuous monitoring of enrichments with potential suspension of enrichment providers if there is evidence of a sudden quality degradation or kind of evidence of fraud. Next slide. Okay, so digesting all of that, we're going to move into the discussion phase. We're not going to break out, so we can just do it as one group. But at the end of these, we'll kind of capture some notes, put it all together so we can incorporate it in the output for the session. Next slide. Just some brief reminders relative to our other sessions. We allow everyone's perspectives. I'm going to try not to talk too much. Other folks will not try and talk too much. We want to hear your perspectives. We adhere to Chatham House rules, so we don't attribute remarks to individuals, either in feeding back to the group in the discussion or in any other kind of public-facing forums related to the work that we're doing. And this is true in how we produce the documentation. So we anonymize everyone's comments and perspectives.
Okay, I think we're pretty much all back now. Juan Pablo, do you want to report out for your group, or you have a nominated speaker?
I forgot to nominate a speaker, so I guess that means I've accidentally left myself on the hook for it, because I'm not going to call on anyone in without having given them warning. So overall, I think there was a bit of a sense of overwhelm around the depth and detail that's in the document, and so I think that something to keep in mind that there's some thoughts that are probably going to emerge following the conversation that we had today around people adding a few additional comments. But a couple of there's sort of several things that we've captured in the notes. There is a general sense that the MVP on affiliation sort of seems like a promising start, and it could be a good springboard for other elements that could also be automated and working at scale. But related to this is that the working on elements such as affiliations that can be done sort of by pulling data from a PDF is skating around some of the questions around authority, around who gets to make assertions in the first place, and that is different around for things that couldn't be gleaned off of a document or can be done in an automated in this kind of automated way. This brought up questions around sort of concerns around how do we have assertions be embedded within the enhancement request, or having some ways of being able to see what's where the enhancement is coming from. And that sort of got the conversation going around what are the, could we have trusted sources and people or individuals, organizations that could be trusted to make enhancements, but that there is concerns for abuse in those scenarios when you're trusting people, that even sources that you might have once considered trustworthy. This was brought up in the context of things happening today, and particularly in the US, sources that you might have once considered to be trustworthy might not be as trustworthy in the future. And so these power dynamics between different players and who wants to make assertions need to be considered as part of the resolution, and how you might be able to confirm or resolve any enhancements or any conflicts that arise. The other bigger questions that were raised, so this is sort of our group went into some of these big ones around authority. The other one is around, does the idea of correctness even make sense? Is correctness really the problem, and is fixing the correctness really the solution to that problem? Around is there one correct thing, or is there need to be ways of having different people make different selections around what they're considering to be the most correct? So no, obviously, no, we didn't resolve that question, but there's just questions that were raised by the implementation scenario, and again, drawn from this idea around, one thing is capturing what's in a document. You can say, is it what that document says? But it's different if you're trying to talk about things that are not so just about asserting what's present in a particular PDF file or in a particular published location.
Great.
I think that's it, but obviously there's others in the group that if anyone wants to, if there's a couple of other sort of smaller points, I think, or ones that may be less worthy of discussion and conversation, but so I will with the whole group, because they're more just sort of points that people have made that I think are worth considering. But I'll leave it there. If anyone else wants to jump in and throw in some additional points, be happy to have those shared by others in the group.
Okay. I think let's move. John, your group.
Sure. Yeah. We were group 2, so we tried harder, and we we had a great conversation. Some of the issues that Juan Pablo was bringing up came up in ours as well. We we're talking about trust and trust indicators, both for governance, like making sure there's global representation, so we're mitigating the risks of disrupting governments and regime changes that happen around the world through governance that's globally represented. We also talked about trust in terms of trust from sources of information, and how do we determine that, how to gauge and to measure the trustworthiness of sources of information. And while that has been discussed within COMET and other circles in the past, one thing that we were bringing up was that it's important for the criteria, the framework for that trustworthiness, how we're measuring it, for that to be something that is open and available for people to understand and consume, so that there's a good knowledge across the ecosystem of what our trust indicators are really based on. So that was one big piece of the discussion, was just around trust and how to build that within the community in different ways. Another one was around openness, and just, openness is nice for many different reasons. It's nice for building community and helping community action, but it's also nice for lowering costs. Open sources of information are important for institutions and others around the world to be able to think about lowering the cost of their internal systems. And so how can COMET not only help with building community from an openness perspective in terms of how to bring different open communities together, but also think about it in terms of efficiencies. And then a big piece of our discussion was around how do we build this workflow that is exposed through the implementation scenario, where there is a set of information that comes into a pipeline and then gets published out. How do we do that when there are multiple sources of information that are coming in? And the discussion we turned to was, that there's going to be multiple players out there. There's already multiple open sources of information that we know about. There's not just one, there's not a single source that we're talking about here. And so how do we make sure that we have audit trails for people to see that? And what's the level of implementation that makes it worth people getting all that information about different sources of truth? And then also the decision making that happens of what we would publish out. And so Christina walked us through an example scenario of harvesting information from OpenAlex or some other source like that, and then how a university CRIS system is kind of ingest that stuff. And so just by walking through that example scenario, we were able to also kind of tease out some of the complexities of the implementation scenario that we circulated. And so there's more information about that in the notes. Anybody else from group 2 want to speak up? Yeah, I think it was really good to walk through some of the complexities of the scenario.
Great. Okay, so Adam.
Yeah, so we are group 3, so we tried the hardest since it's now a competitive kind of team thing. No, but more seriously, there was kind of general agreement that affiliations would be a good starting point relative to this scenario, with some caveats of concerns about essentially temporal relationships between authorships, how things were represented at the time a work was produced versus where a researcher is now, and how to kind of associate or capture the kind of provenance and ownership concerns around that. Similarly, there was a mention of cases where essentially the input is too lacking or insufficient to really take action on. So we can think of examples of like ambiguous affiliation assertions for which no real correct claim can be made. So it's kind of like author says they're at a very ambiguously named university. How do we actually determine where that is? Maybe the author themselves has an ambiguous name. Moving on from there, we kind of had a main thread, which was about the kind of overall kind of strategic challenge of the model, which is also discussed kind of to a large extent in the read ahead comments. So I would encourage folks to go in and kind of add some additional thoughts there. But to kind of summarize, the main reason why folks felt we're here is that there's these kind of monolithic data sources without provenance problems that create problems relative to the volume and need for assertions that need to be made and incorporated by others. So when we think about how a DOI record is produced, someone does some form of research, creates a research output. It goes through this really complicated chain of custody and creation that corresponds into a DOI record. And there's actually a whole bunch of provenance information and things that happen and assertions that are made relative to that research object that then all disappear. And there's just a DOI record that's owned by someone. So if we want to move away from this monolithic model, we have to kind of think about the separation of concerns and avoid all of those obstacles in how we do enrichments. And this was kind of broken down into 3 layers that folks were thinking about. So there's the making assertions layer, meaning you have a DOI record. Anyone can make assertions about its quality or completeness in various respects. Then there's a validation layer that attempts to do some form of kind of assessment of the correctness of those assertions. Now, this is kind of multipolar in that There can be correctness in terms of, very baseline correctness as it relates to representation on an object. There can be correctness as demonstrated by use of the enrichment by others, so as a form of signal. And then there can be correctness relative to some of these more sticky kind of questions that we were talking about, where multiple things can be true, and they're kind of sitting in parallel with each other. And then finally, there's a third layer, which is the integration of the data back into the RAs. So in thinking about how to implement even this for affiliations, kind of using that frame of and making assertions about affiliations, what layers of validation or claims need to occur relative to those assertions, and then how can that data be integrated back, and who is it being integrated back? Meaning, is it being integrated back by other folks who just find those validated assertions useful, who find the full set of assertions useful, who into the actual DOI records by registration agencies? Those are all kind of like separate concerns that have to be addressed. Going through my notes. There was some consideration also about kind of the willingness of RAs to integrate into enrichment. So in the context of the scenario, we frame this as a non-destructive representation, where a service like an RA could essentially create a layer that says this set of enrichments sit on top or next to a record, and there should be an API, but the record itself is not affected in any way. Is this something that they would want to do? Is this something that they would find valuable? Who would be willing to do that? There was also an interesting point that was raised in terms of consumption of enrichment by other folks that aren't registration agencies, in that so let's say we take those first two layers where people make assertions, they get validated by some process, and other folks want to incorporate them, including with the record. At that point, they might also be doing other things to the record, such that there would be like another layer of assertions that would need to be made. And even if those specific enrichments were incorporated into the record, there are other kind of things that are happening on top, such that the data chain requires different forms of ingest and incorporation relative to the record for a given what someone is doing on top of it. So how do we think about that kind of process, where it's not just a straightforward consumption of DOI records, consumption of enrichment, but consumption of DOI records, consumption of enrichments, additional things that now have changed the object into something else? And then how does that feed all back into the chain? Yeah, okay, I'll pause there so we have time for other folks to raise any thoughts or questions in our group or more generally.
Adam, I think you did a great job of getting a load of ideas that were bouncing around in our group to kind of maybe distill one or two of them.
Sure.
I think there's a strategic risk to this whole thing if it's predicated on ultimately landing a fix back in an RA's metadata store, because that's like a Boolean yes or no. Was it accepted or not? So that would be the end of those stages that Adam was talking about, but maybe not the primary goal. If it is, then we'd be trying to solve all of those problems in one go, whereas doing them in hops, I think, would be more achievable, especially if there were multiple places that the metadata would get ingested back into. Each of those may have different syntax, different diff syntax, whatever, for integrating back in. And each of those might also be a trust signal. So I think we've talked about corroborating trust signals, like all these people have asserted the same thing, but how about these RAs or these sources have agreed and pulled it back in, and that's a corroboration of that correction. So yeah, it's kind of challenging the idea that it's a straight line, right? Things come in from many places, but they may also go back out to many places. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was, I liked also consumption as a signal of correctness and desire for consumption, kind of like a marketplace of enrichments, and that their value is being asserted relative to that. So yeah. I don't know if any other folks from the group wanted to add anything. Okay, we'll turn things back over to Claire.
Okay, I'm going to just wrap up with a few kind of next steps. I'm going to what to expect next. This is kind of our timeline of activity. You've seen it before, but we are just kind of at the wrapping up the discussion portion of the task force. So if anybody who has additional comments on the read ahead could provide those by the end of the week, then next week we'll be documenting that And then the first week of March is when we're aiming to release the community call to action with a webinar on March 5th, going over that. I will be sending out an email with the details, but you can also find a link to that webinar to register for it on the COMET homepage. We've also posted to LinkedIn. So that's kind of where we are. We'll be spending March kind of making sure that the community call to action is properly kind of circulated among the wider community. So things that we need from you, absolutely kind of helping with the additional comments on the read ahead, potentially also the community call to action. We're in kind of the drafting stage of that at the moment. And then, yes, please do share that webinar information and get as many people involved as possible. In retrospect, we should have called it COMETCon, but we didn't. We're calling it the Community Call to Action webinar. Never mind, that was a wasted opportunity. And there was one other thing. What was the other thing that we wanted? Oh, yes. If anybody would like to provide kind of more of your perspectives in the form of kind of an interview that we can publish to the blog, if you'd like to do that, please do reach out and let me know. We have one participant who has done that. We'll be publishing their perspectives, but it would be great to have more perspectives from participants about why you think that looking at this kind of approach is important. So please do email me if you'd like to participate. I have some draft questions, but if you'd like to, put together your own blog post, that's great too, based on your perspective. So do get in touch. I think that's it. John, Adam, Juan, Pablo, do you have any additionals? No?
Just that when we do this webinar on March 5th, we really will rely on all of you to help us with the promotion. We want to get as many people as possible to attend the webinar, learn about the work we did here, and get their eyes on the call to action, trying to get as many proposals and people thinking about it as possible. One of the goals of all of this is to get the community interested, get them understanding the opportunities. And so we really will need your help with promoting it through your circles. So
yeah, I'll only use the last second, just plug again to reach out to Claire on participating in the blog if you feel so inclined. It doesn't even if you didn't you don't need to have gone into all of the details and get the full implementation scenario entirely all in your head. It's really about more broad than that, and just to get your perspective as to what your involvement has been and your interest in seeing COMET succeed. So I just wanted to use those last seconds to plug there, because that's going to be part of the promotion of making sure that we get all of the folks then to see the community call to action and to actually want to be engaged and participate. And what we're looking for is really that eventual engagement from the broader community.